They let their daughter hit my son, then forced him to apologize. The next day, they regretted everything. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to subscribe and drop a comment below telling us where you're listening from. We'd love to give you a shout out in our next video. I sat on the faded wooden bench by the playground, watching my son, Liam, as he carefully built a tower of bright, plastic blocks beneath the sun's warm glow. He was 6, small for his age, but bursting with a quiet curiosity that always made me smile. His dark hair glistened in the light, and every so often, he'd pause to look over at me, a small grin tugging at his lips as if to share the wonder of his creation. Around us, the neighborhood kids ran and played, their laughter and shrieks filling the air with an easy, joyful noise. It was the kind of day that made you believe in the simple magic of childhood, until she arrived. She came over with her blonde curls bouncing in the breeze, a pink dress swaying around her knees. Her name was Emily, and she was the daughter of the Fergusons, a family who had always carried themselves with the weight of money and entitlement. Emily was the kind of girl who never heard the word no, and it showed in the sharp set of her jaw as she marched up to Liam's blocks. "I want to play with those," she demanded, her voice sweet but edged with something that reminded me too much of her mother's tone. Liam looked up, startled, and then gave her a gentle smile, offering her a block from his carefully balanced tower. But she wasn't satisfied with a single piece. Emily reached out and knocked the whole thing down with a swift flick of her hand. The blocks scattered across the sand, and my son's shoulders drooped as he looked at the ruin of what he'd made. He didn't cry. Liam never cried. He just sat there, stunned, while Emily stood over him, a small smirk playing on her lips. I rose from the bench, my chest tightening as I watched the scene unfold, the weight of what I'd seen pressing against my ribs like a fist. I walked over slowly, trying to keep my voice even. "Emily, that wasn't very nice," I said, my words measured. But before I could say more, her parents were there, Mrs. Ferguson in her crisp linen dress, pearls at her throat like a badge of her station, and Mr. Ferguson, who always seemed to wear a suit even on the warmest days. Mrs. Ferguson's eyes swept over me, dismissing me in that single glance, and she crouched beside her daughter, cooing in that syrupy voice, "Are you okay, sweetie? Did the boy do something to upset you?" I felt my jaw clench, the heat rising up my neck. "No," I said firmly. "Your daughter knocked over my son's blocks." Liam looked up at me then, his small hands twisting in his lap, and I could see the faint quiver of his bottom lip. I reached down and rested a hand on his shoulder, giving him a reassuring squeeze. But Mrs. Ferguson's lips tightened into a thin line, and she gave a little laugh, light, airy, but with no real humor. "Boys can be so rough," she said, her tone bright as glass. "I'm sure he did something to deserve it." My son's eyes widened, and he shook his head quickly. "No, Daddy, I didn't," he said, his voice small and earnest. My heart cracked a little at the sound of it. This boy who had never learned to lie, who only wanted to build his towers and share them with the world. But Mrs. Ferguson ignored him, her gaze fixed on me, her voice turning cold as she said, "It's best if your son apologizes to Emily. She was only trying to play, and he must have been unwelcoming." For a moment, the world seemed to tilt around me, the playground noise fading into a distant hum as my pulse roared in my ears. I looked at Liam, my gentle boy, who had done nothing but try to share his blocks. And I saw the confusion in his eyes, the hurt that was already taking root like a weed in the soft soil of his heart. I wanted to shout, to tear away the smug smile that hovered on Emily's lips and the cool disdain in her mother's eyes. But instead, I knelt beside my son and whispered, "You don't have to say sorry for something you didn't do, Liam." But Liam was only 6, and he didn't have the armor of years or the steel of knowing right from wrong in the face of power. He looked at me, then at Emily, and his shoulders slumped. "I'm sorry," he said, the words as fragile as glass, and Emily just smiled, her fingers curling around the block she'd stolen from his tower. Mr. Ferguson gave me a look then, something smug and dismissive, and said, "Glad that's settled. before turning away, already moving on to his next conquest. Mrs. Ferguson smoothed a hand over Emily's hair and murmured, "Come along, darling. Let's leave the poor boy to his games." I watched them walk away, my son's small hand slipping into mine as he stared at the ground, his tower in ruins around him. My heart was a storm of rage and sorrow, the injustice of it burning in my chest like a brand. I knew then that this wasn't over, that I wouldn't let this small, cruel moment define my son's world or his worth. Because if there's one thing I've learned in this life, it's that even the smallest voices can grow loud when the time is right. And I would make sure my son's voice was heard. That evening, as the sun sank behind the row of houses and the last of the children's laughter faded into memory, I sat on the couch with Liam nestled beside me. He was unusually quiet, his fingers worrying the edge of his t-shirt as he stared at the flickering images on the television screen without really seeing them. I wrapped an arm around his small shoulders and pulled him close, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of his head. The scent of sun-warmed sand still clung to his hair, and it made me ache for the innocence he was already being forced to surrender. My wife, Mia, sat across from us, her brow furrowed as she watched us, her eyes filled with the same helpless fury that burned in my chest. "I don't understand how they can act like that," Mia said softly, her voice trembling with the weight of her frustration. "He did nothing wrong, and they made him say sorry like he was the one who hurt her." I nodded, my jaw tight as I replayed the scene in my mind again and again, Liam's small voice, so hesitant and unsure, and the way Emily's parents had dismissed him like he was nothing. It was a memory that felt like a splinter in my heart, and I knew it wouldn't work itself free until I did something about it. Liam looked up at us then, his eyes wide and uncertain. "Daddy, did I do something bad?" he asked, and the question nearly undid me. How could I explain to him that the world wasn't always fair, that sometimes people with money and power could bend the truth to their will? I swallowed hard and forced a gentle smile, running my hand through his hair. "No, buddy," I said, my voice low and firm. "You didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes people just don't see things the way they really are. But that doesn't mean you were wrong." Mia reached over and took his hand, her own face softening as she said, "We're proud of you, Liam. Don't ever forget that." He nodded slowly, his small fingers curling around hers, and I could see the faint spark of hope in his eyes. But I also saw the doubt that had been planted there, the seed of uncertainty that Emily and her parents had sown so effortlessly. And I knew that if I didn't do something, if I didn't show him that truth and justice still mattered, then that seed would grow, twisting itself around his heart until he started to believe the lies they'd forced on him. After Liam had drifted off to sleep, his soft breathing a steady comfort in the quiet house, Mia and I sat at the kitchen table, our hands wrapped around mugs of lukewarm tea. "We can't let this go," she said, her voice a whisper but her eyes hard with resolve. "They can't just keep getting away with treating people like this. Not our son." I nodded, my mind already racing with plans. I thought of Mr. Ferguson's smug smile, of the way Mrs. Ferguson had looked at us like we were something beneath her notice. They'd built their lives on power and privilege, and they expected the world to bow to them. But I was done bowing. "I'm going to find out everything I can about them," I said quietly, the words feeling heavy but necessary in my mouth. "I won't let them think they can just erase what happened, what they did to him." Mia's eyes met mine across the table, and in that moment, I saw the same fierce determination that had drawn me to her all those years ago. "Then I'll help you," she said simply, and I knew she meant it. We were in this together, a family united by the quiet promise we made to our son that he would always have someone in his corner, no matter how powerful his enemies might seem. The next morning, I woke early, the first rays of dawn painting the sky in pale pink and gold. Liam was still sleeping, his face peaceful in the gentle light, and I took a moment to just watch him, my son, my reason for every breath I took. Then I rose and turned on my computer, the glow of the screen bright against the shadows of the quiet house. I started with the Fergusons' public profiles, scrolling through pages of carefully curated images and posts that painted them as the perfect family. Charity galas, expensive vacations, Emily's face beaming in photos that didn't show the cruelty she'd learned so young. But beneath the glossy surface, I knew there had to be cracks. No family that lived on the pedestal they'd built for themselves could be as perfect as they claimed. I dug deeper, combing through old news articles and property records, following threads that led to rumors of shady business deals and whispered affairs. Every discovery was a small victory, a crack in the armor they'd wrapped around themselves. And with every crack, I felt my resolve harden. I wasn't just doing this for Liam. I was doing it for every quiet kid who'd been told to apologize for someone else's mistakes, every gentle soul who'd been crushed under the weight of another's lies. Mia joined me a few hours later, her hand resting on my shoulder as she read over my findings. "You're really doing this," she said softly, her voice filled with equal parts pride and worry. I nodded, my eyes fixed on the screen. "They think they're untouchable," I said, my voice calm but laced with steel. "But no one is untouchable, not when the truth is on your side." We spent the rest of the day gathering everything we could, documents, witness accounts, anything that could shine a light on the darkness the Fergusons tried so hard to hide. And as the sun set once more, casting long shadows across the quiet street, I felt a sense of purpose settle over me like a second skin. Tomorrow, I would show them that the quiet father they dismissed was more than just a face in the crowd. Tomorrow, they would see what it looked like when the truth refused to be silenced. The next day dawned with a restless energy, as if the air itself could sense the storm brewing beneath the calm surface of our lives. I spent the morning at my kitchen table, a steaming mug of coffee growing cold beside me as I pored over the files and notes I'd gathered in the past few hours. Each scrap of information felt like a puzzle piece, and as I carefully fit them together, a picture of the Fergusons emerged that was far removed from the polished image they so carefully cultivated. It was a picture of greed and entitlement, of a family who believed the rules didn't apply to them, until now. Liam padded into the kitchen, still rubbing sleep from his eyes, and climbed into my lap with a sigh. He didn't say anything, just rested his head on my chest as I ran a hand through his hair. I wanted to tell him that everything would be all right, that the world wasn't as cruel as it had seemed the day before, but I also knew that words meant nothing without action. I pressed a kiss to his forehead and held him close, the warmth of his small body a quiet reminder of why I was doing this. For him, for every quiet voice that had ever been silenced by someone bigger or louder. After Mia took Liam to school, I picked up the phone and made a call to my old friend, David. David and I had known each other since college, back when we both believed we'd conquer the world with nothing but ambition and a stubborn refusal to settle. David had chosen a different path, one that led him to journalism, and he had a knack for uncovering the truth that no one else wanted to see. When he answered, his voice was warm with familiarity. "What's going on?" he asked, and I could hear the curiosity in his tone. David always knew when something bigger was at play. I took a breath and told him everything, about Liam, about the playground, about the Fergusons, and the way they'd forced my son to apologize for something he didn't do, and about the information I'd uncovered since. There was a moment of silence on the line, and then David's voice dropped to a low, thoughtful tone. "You've got something here," he said, "but you need to be careful. People like the Fergusons, they're used to burying the truth." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "I know," I said, "but I can't let this go. Not for Liam. Not for anyone." David agreed to help me sort through what I had, to find the threads that would be strongest in the court of public opinion. He promised to keep my name out of it, to let the truth speak for itself without drawing a target on my back. I trusted him. David had always known how to wield the power of words like a sword, and I knew he would do it with care. When I hung up the phone, I felt a flicker of hope spark in my chest. This wasn't just about my family anymore. It was about standing up to the quiet tyranny of those who thought they could crush anyone who didn't bow to them. That afternoon, I went back to the playground with Liam. The sky was bright and clear, but the weight of what had happened still hung heavy in the air. The other parents were there, chatting in small clusters while their children played. I felt their eyes on me as I walked across the sand, Liam's small hand tucked into mine. Some of them nodded politely, their smiles tight with discomfort, while others looked away entirely. I knew what they were thinking, that it was easier to stay quiet, to let things slide rather than stir up trouble. But I wasn't interested in what was easy. I was interested in what was right. I watched as Emily played in the sandbox, her laughter ringing out like a bell. She glanced up once and met Liam's eyes, and for a moment, something flickered in her expression. Uncertainty, maybe, or the faintest glimmer of guilt. But then it was gone, replaced by the smug tilt of her chin that I knew so well. Mrs. Ferguson was there too, her designer sunglasses perched on her nose and a carefully curated smile on her lips. When she saw me, her smile widened, but her eyes stayed cold. "Hello," she said brightly, her voice smooth as glass. "I hope there's no hard feelings after yesterday." I looked at her, the polite facade she wore like armor, and felt a strange calm settle over me. "Of course not," I said, my voice even. "Children will be children, after all." She seemed taken aback by my tone, as if she'd expected me to flinch or apologize all over again. But I had no apologies left to give. Liam squeezed my hand, and I gave him a reassuring smile. "Go play, buddy," I said softly. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded and ran off to join the other kids, his laughter carrying across the sand. I watched him go, the weight in my chest lifting just a little with every step he took. Mrs. Ferguson turned away, her attention already shifting to another mother with an expensive stroller and a carefully rehearsed laugh. I watched her for a moment longer, then walked away, my mind already turning over the next steps. I had everything I needed now. The truth, the evidence, and the means to share it with the world. The Fergusons thought they'd silenced us, that their money and influence would always keep them safe. But they'd forgotten something important. The quiet ones are always listening. And sometimes, they're the ones with the sharpest knives. As the sun dipped lower in the sky and the playground began to empty, I felt a sense of quiet determination settle into my bones. Tomorrow, I would meet with David and put everything into motion. Tomorrow, I would show the Fergusons and everyone else what it looked like when the truth refused to be buried. And as I took Liam's hand and led him home, I knew that no matter how long the storm might rage, we would stand together. Because in the end, the truth is stronger than any lie, and I would make sure it echoed louder than their money ever could. The following morning arrived with a soft rain tapping against the windows, a gentle prelude to the storm that was about to break. I woke early, my thoughts sharper than they'd been in days, every detail of the plan clicking into place with quiet certainty. As I dressed, I moved through the house on silent feet, careful not to wake Liam or Mia. This was something I needed to do alone. In the kitchen, I poured myself a cup of coffee, the bitter scent anchoring me in the present. Today was the day everything would change. I met David at a small cafe on the edge of town, a place where the tables were always crowded with chatter, but where no one paid attention to anything but their own conversations. He was already there, a folder spread out in front of him, his expression focused and serious. "Morning," he said as I sat down, his eyes scanning my face. "You sure you're ready for this?" I nodded, my fingers curling around the warm mug in front of me. "I have to be," I said, my voice steady. "For Liam. For the truth." David studied me for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "All right," he said. "Let's make this count." He laid out the plan in careful, deliberate strokes, each piece fitting together like the final moves in a chess game. We'd release the story through his paper's website, backed up with the evidence I gathered. Financial records that showed the Fergusons' questionable dealings, witness accounts from people who'd been pushed down so the Fergusons could rise up. David's team would verify everything, making sure there were no loose ends for the Fergusons to pull at. It was the kind of thoroughness that made me trust him completely. This wasn't about gossip or rumors. It was about exposing the truth, once and for all. After we'd finalized the details, I went to the playground one last time before the story went live. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the air cool and fresh, and the playground was empty except for Emily and her parents. She was perched on a swing, idly kicking at the wet sand, while Mr. and Mrs. Ferguson stood nearby, their conversation low and intimate. I took a deep breath and walked over, my footsteps muffled by the damp ground. When they saw me, Mrs. Ferguson's smile was polite but guarded, a flicker of unease in her eyes. "Good morning," she said, her voice light and sweet as always. "What brings you here today?" I looked at them, at the carefully cultivated perfection they wore like a second skin, and felt a surge of quiet satisfaction. "Just thought I'd let you know," I said evenly, "that your secrets won't stay hidden much longer." For a moment, there was only silence, the gentle patter of rain, the only sound between us. Mrs. Ferguson's smile faltered, her lips parting slightly as if to protest. Mr. Ferguson's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice low and sharp. I held his gaze without flinching. "You'll see soon enough," I said calmly. "I'm done letting you teach my son that the world belongs to people like you." Emily shifted on the swing, her small face pale as she watched the exchange. There was no smirk there now, no smug tilt to her chin out. Just the uncertainty of a child who suddenly sees the cracks in the foundation of everything she's been taught. I almost felt sorry for her in that moment. But then I thought of Liam's face when he'd been forced to say sorry, the way his shoulders had slumped under the weight of their lies. And the pity vanished, replaced by the quiet steel of purpose. This was their lesson to learn, not mine. I turned and walked away, leaving them standing there in the soft rain, the echo of my words hanging heavy in the air. As I walked, I felt lighter than I had in days. I thought of Liam, of the way his eyes had searched mine for answers, and I knew I was giving him the only one that mattered, that you don't have to be powerful to be right, that sometimes the quiet voice is the one that carries the furthest. And as I reached the edge of the playground, I allowed myself a small smile. The Fergusons had built their world on sand, and today, the tide was coming in. Later that afternoon, David called me. His voice crackled with a mixture of excitement and gravity. "It's live," he said simply. "Everything's out there now." My heart thudded in my chest, a heavy beat of relief and anticipation. I opened the news site on my phone, my fingers trembling just a little as I scrolled through the headline. Local power couple's web of lies exposed. Community stunned by revelations of fraud and abuse. Beneath it, the details I'd gathered so carefully, each fact a nail in the coffin of the Fergusons' reputation. I read through it slowly, each word a quiet affirmation that the truth could still matter in a world that so often bowed to wealth and influence. The article didn't mention me by name. David had kept his promise. But I could see my fingerprints all over it, the quiet proof that sometimes, even the smallest acts of defiance can change everything. And as I read, I felt something shift inside me, a weight I hadn't even known I was carrying finally lifting from my shoulders. By evening, the fallout had already begun. My phone buzzed with messages from parents at the playground, their words a mix of shock and quiet relief. "I always wondered," one mother wrote. "Thank you for speaking up." Another simply said, "Finally, someone had the courage." Each message was a small light in the darkness, proof that the truth, once spoken, could find 1,000 echoes. And through it all, I thought of Liam, his quiet strength and the way he'd held my hand when he didn't have the words to understand. This was for him, all of it. As the sun set, casting the sky in shades of gold and rose, I sat on the porch with Mia, our hands intertwined. We didn't speak for a long time, just watched the sky shift and listened to the quiet murmur of the world settling around us. Finally, she turned to me, her eyes bright with pride. "You did it," she said softly. I shook my head. "We did it," I said, and she smiled. Because she knew, just as I did, that the fight for the truth is never really over. But for tonight, at least, we'd won. The morning after the article broke, the quiet suburb seemed to crackle with a new energy, as if the very air had shifted in some subtle, irreversible way. I woke to the soft ping of messages and calls, some from parents I barely knew, others from neighbors who'd always kept their distance. Each message carried a different note: disbelief, relief, even a few that hinted at fear. But beneath them all was one unifying thread, a recognition that the Fergusons were no longer untouchable. Their name, once a symbol of influence and privilege, was now a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones around kitchen tables. Mia and I sat at the breakfast table, the smell of coffee and toast mingling with the quiet hum of the neighborhood beyond our window. Liam sat between us, his small hands carefully arranging slices of toast into a pattern only he understood. He didn't know the details of what had happened. He was too young for the intricacies of adult betrayal and exposure. But he sensed the shift in the air, the way the grown-ups carried themselves differently. "Are you okay, Daddy?" he asked, his voice as soft as a summer breeze. I looked at him and smiled, reaching over to ruffle his hair. "I'm more than okay, buddy," I said. "I'm proud of you. And I'm proud of us." As the day unfolded, the true weight of what we'd done began to sink in. The Fergusons' perfect facade was unraveling thread by thread, and the community that had once turned a blind eye was now wide awake. I heard it in the way people spoke in the grocery store, their conversations hushed but urgent. "Did you see the story?" they'd murmur, eyes darting around to see who else might be listening. "Can you believe it? All this time, and we never knew." There was a kind of vindication in their voices, a quiet satisfaction that the truth had finally been forced into the light. But not everyone was relieved. By late afternoon, the Fergusons themselves had begun their own counteroffensive. Mr. Ferguson called me, his voice dripping with barely restrained fury. "You think you've won?" he spat, his words as sharp as broken glass. "You've humiliated my family. Do you know what you've done?" I took a deep breath, my fingers tightening around the phone. "I did what needed to be done," I said simply. "Your lies were hurting people. My son was just the first. It had to stop." There was a pause on the other end, a breath that sounded like a warning. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You'll regret this." But as I ended the call, I felt nothing but a steady calm. Maybe it wasn't over, but I was no longer afraid. The Fergusons could bluster and threaten all they wanted, but the truth was out now, like a spark that had caught the dry grass of the playground and was burning bright for everyone to see. And in the face of that truth, their threats felt as empty as their apologies. The real test came later that evening. Liam and I walked back to the playground, the soft twilight casting everything in a gentle glow. The parents were there, clustered in small groups like always, but now their conversation stopped as we approached. For a moment, I wondered if they would turn away from us, if the Fergusons' influence still had enough weight to isolate us, to make us the outcasts for daring to speak the truth. But then one by one, they turned to face us, their expressions open and filled with something I hadn't expected: gratitude. A mother I barely knew stepped forward, her little girl clinging shyly to her leg. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but steady, "for standing up. For all of us." I smiled, my throat tight with the weight of her words. Around us, others nodded, some offering small smiles, others simply meeting my gaze with an unspoken understanding. Liam squeezed my hand, his eyes bright as he looked up at me. In that moment, I knew he was starting to understand, even if he couldn't yet put it into words. He knew that his father had fought for him, and for every child who'd ever been told to bow their head and stay silent. As the sun slipped below the horizon and the playground lights flickered on, I saw Emily sitting alone on the edge of the sandbox. Her face was pale, her usual confidence nowhere to be seen. She looked up as Liam and I passed by, her eyes meeting mine for a brief, fleeting moment. There was no smirk this time, no tilt of her chin. Just a small, uncertain girl who was starting to see that actions have consequences, even for those who once believed themselves above it all. Mia joined us at the playground, her face glowing with quiet pride as she slipped her arm through mine. We stood there together, a family united by the simple, unshakable truth that we'd chosen to stand up rather than look away. The Fergusons might still have their wealth and their connections, but they'd lost something far more valuable: the trust of the community they'd tried so hard to manipulate. And that was a loss no amount of money could ever mend. As we walked home that night, Liam's small voice broke the comfortable silence. "Daddy," he said, his tone thoughtful, "are the bad people gone now?" I bent down to look him in the eyes, my hand resting gently on his shoulder. "Not always," I said honestly. "But the important thing is to always stand up for what's right, no matter how big or strong they seem." He nodded slowly, a thoughtful frown creasing his brow. "Okay," he said softly. And in that simple word, I heard the promise of a future where he'd never doubt his own worth again. The final pieces of this story settled into place like the last rays of a setting sun. A calm had descended over our house that weekend, a hush that was different from the tension that had filled the air days before. Mia moved around the kitchen with easy grace, making pancakes while Liam sat at the table, carefully arranging his crayons in neat rows. The radio hummed in the background, the quiet murmur of the world outside. But beneath it all was the steady beat of something new. Something stronger. We'd faced the storm and emerged, not untouched, but unbroken. As the day unfolded, I found myself watching Liam with a kind of quiet wonder. He was laughing again, the soft, easy kind of laughter that only children can manage. His shoulders didn't slump with doubt or fear anymore, and when he looked at me, there was no question in his eyes about his worth. That was worth more than any victory, more than any headline. I reached over and ruffled his hair, and he leaned into it, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Daddy," he said, his voice bright with curiosity, "can we go back to the playground today?" I nodded, my heart lifting. "Of course, buddy," I said. "Let's show them how strong you are." We walked to the playground that afternoon, the sun warm on our shoulders and the soft breeze carrying the scent of summer. The other families were there, scattered across the grass and benches, their laughter mingling with the rustle of leaves. There was no longer that edge of caution in their glances, no more of the forced politeness that had once separated us from them. Instead, there was a quiet camaraderie, an unspoken understanding that the lines drawn by money and status were just illusions, after all. Emily was there too, sitting quietly in the sandbox with her mother. She didn't look up as we approached, her small hands buried in the sand, her shoulders hunched like she was trying to make herself invisible. Mrs. Ferguson watched us, her face pale and tight, the glossy perfection of her smile gone. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came. In that silence, I felt the final shift of power, the understanding that we were no longer the ones expected to bow our heads. I gave her a small nod, polite but distant, and turned my attention back to Liam. He ran ahead of me, his laughter ringing out as he raced to the swings. I watched him for a moment, the way his hair shone in the sun, the way he threw his head back and laughed like the world was nothing but possibility. And in that moment, I felt a peace settle over me that I hadn't known in years. I realized that this wasn't just about the Fergusons, or even about what had happened in the sandbox. It was about the lesson Liam had learned. One that I hoped he'd carry with him for the rest of his life, that it's not enough to be right in your heart. Sometimes, you have to stand up and say it out loud. As the afternoon stretched on, Mia joined us at the playground, her smile soft and bright as she watched Liam soar higher and higher on the swing. She slipped her hand into mine, her fingers warm and strong. "He's free," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet pride. "He knows he's worth fighting for." I nodded, my throat tight with the truth of it. "We all are," I said, "and we always will be." The sun began to dip low in the sky, painting the world in gold and rose as we made our way home. Liam held my hand, his small fingers warm in mine, and I felt the weight of every promise I'd made to him. Not just the promise to protect him, but the promise to show him that even the smallest voice can change the world. that he didn't have to be loud to be strong or rich to be respected, that he only had to be true to himself, and that would always be enough. When we reached home, I sat with Liam on the porch, the cool evening air carrying the sweet scent of cut grass and distant barbecues. He leaned his head against my arm, his eyes half closed in the fading light. "Daddy," he said softly, "are they gone now? The bad people?" I looked out at the quiet street, at the gentle glow of the streetlights flickering to life. "They're still out there," I said honestly. "But we don't have to let them decide who we are. We choose that. Always." He nodded slowly, his small face thoughtful. "I like that," he said. "I choose me." And in those simple words, I heard the echo of everything we'd fought for. Mia came out to join us, wrapping her arms around us both, and we sat there in the quiet, watching the stars begin to appear one by one in the darkening sky. For the first time in days, I felt the world settle around us in a way that felt whole and true. The Fergusons might still have their money and their secrets, but they no longer had the power to make us feel small. And as I looked at my son, at the quiet strength that shone in his eyes, I knew that was the real victory. Tomorrow, the world would keep turning. There would be new battles to fight, new truths to speak. But for tonight, we were together. We were safe, and we were stronger than we'd ever been. Thank you for listening to this story. If you found yourself moved by this journey and the quiet strength of a father's love, please subscribe to our channel, leave a comment to share your thoughts, and don't forget to like and share this story with others who need a reminder that even the smallest voices can change the world.